The old cabin sat quietly at the edge of a small town, where the forest met the open fields. It was the kind of place people drove past without noticing, except for the tall wooden fence and the small mailbox with a single name on it. Rayner. Jack Rayner had lived there for almost 3 years now. He liked it that way. Quiet, simple, far from the noise and pressure of the world he once knew. Every morning before the sun came up, he would walk out with his dog, Shadow, a big Belgian Malinois with golden brown fur and sharp, loyal eyes. Together they ran the dirt trail that looped around the property. It was their routine, steady, calm, and always the same. For most people in town, Jack was just another retired man keeping to himself. He bought groceries once a week, paid in cash, and nodded politely when people said hello. He never talked much about his past, and no one really asked. People figured he was a veteran, maybe from the army, given the way he carried himself. Straight posture, sharp eyes, a calmness that came from years of knowing how to stay composed. But nobody knew the full story. The truth was, Jack had spent more than 2 decades serving his country in ways most people would never imagine. He had been part of missions that never made it to the news, in places that didn't officially exist. He had been a leader of men who did the impossible. And yet, when he came home for good, all he wanted was peace. Peace to Jack wasn't silence, it was purpose without chaos. He found that in the quiet rhythm of small-town life. He built things with his hands again, fixed fences, painted walls, planted trees. He even started a small garden behind the cabin where he grew tomatoes and peppers. It wasn't about the food. It was about keeping his mind and body busy, about grounding himself in something real. But if there was one thing that made life whole again for him, it was Shadow. The dog had been with him since his last year in the service. Back then, Shadow had been part of the same unit, trained to detect explosives and protect soldiers. They had saved each other's lives more times than Jack could count. When Jack retired, the military allowed him to adopt Shadow permanently. From that moment on, they were inseparable. Everywhere Jack went, Shadow followed. If Jack sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, Shadow would rest at his feet. If Jack drove into town, Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the road with the same alertness his owner did. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond built on trust, loyalty, and countless moments of facing danger together. The townspeople knew Shadow, too. Kids sometimes waved from a distance, though their parents always told them not to approach without asking first. The dog was well behaved, but people could tell he was trained for more than just fetching sticks. Jack always smiled softly when someone asked about him. "He's family," he'd say, and that was all they needed to know. Jack's days followed a simple rhythm. Up before sunrise, run with Shadow, breakfast, then work on whatever small project the day called for. Sometimes it was repairing an old fence post, sometimes chopping wood, and sometimes just sitting by the creek behind his property, watching the water flow. At night, he liked to sit outside with the porch light off, just him, Shadow, and the sounds of the forest. The stars above were brighter here than anywhere else he had been. He often thought about his old team, men he'd led, some who never made it home. He didn't talk about them, but he thought about them often. The silence of the woods helped him remember without pain. Jack didn't make many friends in town, but people respected him. The clerk at the hardware store always greeted him kindly. The woman at the diner saved his usual spot near the window. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words carried weight. There was something in his voice that made people listen, a kind of quiet authority that wasn't loud or forceful, but steady and sure. Every few months, the sheriff would stop by to check in on the old veterans living around the area. Jack had met him once or twice. The sheriff was polite but didn't know much about Jack's past. Jack preferred it that way. He never wanted special treatment, never wanted to be seen as anything more than a man trying to live a quiet life. Shadow's presence made that life fuller. Jack often trained him in the backyard, using commands in short, crisp tones. Shadow responded instantly every time. It wasn't for show, it was just how they stayed connected. To an outsider, it might have looked like a man playing fetch with his dog, but to Jack, it was something deeper. It reminded him of discipline, of purpose, of the trust that once kept him alive. Sometimes, while sitting on the porch, Jack would talk to Shadow in low tones. "We've done good, haven't we?" he'd say, scratching behind the dog's ear. Shadow would tilt his head and wag his tail, as if understanding every word. No more deserts, no more jungles, just this. Just peace, and peace was all Jack wanted. He had seen enough of the world's darkness to last a lifetime. He didn't read the news much anymore. It only reminded him how easily things could go wrong. Instead, he focused on what was in front of him. The land, the trees, the dog, and the small joys of each day. But sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, when the wind moved through the trees, Jack's mind wandered back to places he thought he'd forgotten. Faces of men shouting commands, the thump of helicopter blades, the pressure in his chest before a mission. He would wake suddenly, sweating, breathing hard, only to find Shadow beside him. Alert but calm, the dog would rest his head against Jack's arm as if saying, "You're home now." Those moments reminded Jack that healing wasn't something that happened once. It was a process. And Shadow was part of that process. The bond between them wasn't just about companionship, it was survival in a different form. They had both seen things, both lost friends. Together they had found peace. In town, people often wondered what Jack did before he moved there. A few had their theories. Some thought he was just a regular soldier who'd seen too much. Others guessed he might have been law enforcement. But no one truly knew that the quiet man who bought coffee beans from the local shop had once been one of the most skilled commanders in the country. Jack preferred it that way. He didn't need anyone to know who he was. He had already lived that life. Every now and then, a letter arrived in his mailbox from an old friend or fellow veteran. Jack rarely replied, though he read each one carefully. Sometimes they talked about reunions or new programs for veterans, or updates about old missions that were finally declassified. He appreciated the thought but never joined. That world was behind him now. One afternoon, as Jack repaired the small gate near his driveway, a young man passing by stopped to watch. "That's a good-looking dog you've got," the young man said. "Best partner I ever had," Jack replied with a faint smile. "Is he trained?" The young man asked. Jack gave a short nod. "Trained and loyal. Saved my life more times than I can count." The young man laughed, thinking it was a joke, and waved goodbye. Jack just watched him go, then turned back to his work. He wasn't one to explain things. He preferred to let people think what they wanted. The days rolled by like that. Slow, calm, uneventful. For Jack, uneventful was perfect. He didn't need excitement. He didn't need recognition. He just needed his quiet mornings and Shadow's steady presence. Sometimes the wind carried sounds from the highway a few miles away, cars rushing toward lives filled with deadlines and meetings. Jack would listen for a while, then smile faintly. He had once lived at that speed, constantly on alert, constantly moving. Now all he wanted was the slow rhythm of a small town. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack sat on his porch with Shadow lying beside him. The sky turned from gold to deep orange, and the crickets began their nightly chorus. Jack reached down and patted the dog's head. "We did all right, didn't we, boy?" he said softly. Shadow gave a low, contented sound in response. In that moment, everything felt right. The world was calm, and for once so was Jack's mind. He didn't know what the future held, and he didn't care. All that mattered was that for now they had peace. That peace, however, was fragile. Jack didn't know it yet, but soon, the quiet life he had built with Shadow would be shaken in a way he could never have imagined. A simple misunderstanding, a moment of fear, and a decision made too quickly would change everything. But on that warm evening, sitting on the porch with the sound of the forest around him, Jack believed the hard days were behind him. He believed that the world had finally given him a chance to rest, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to hope that it would stay that way. The morning started like any other. Jack woke up before dawn. The sky still dark with a faint line of light on the horizon. The air was cool and the mist hung low over the fields. He stepped out onto the porch with his cup of coffee, the steam rising into the quiet morning. Shadow stood beside him, stretching, his ears flicking as he scanned the tree line like he always did. "Let's go," Jack said softly, setting down the cup. Shadow's tail wagged once, and they began their morning run. They followed the usual trail that wound behind the cabin, through the trees, and along the dirt road leading toward town. The sound of Jack's steady footsteps mixed with the rhythmic breathing of the dog beside him. It was a simple kind of peace, the kind that comes when a man and his companion move in perfect sync. When they got back, the sun was up and the air had warmed. Jack filled Shadow's bowl and cooked breakfast for himself. He had a list of things to do that day, Replace a few boards on the fence, pick up supplies from the hardware store, maybe stop by the diner for a late lunch. It was a good plan, simple and ordinary, exactly how he liked it. Later that morning, Jack loaded a few tools into his old pickup and called for Shadow. The dog jumped into the truck bed like he always did, sitting proudly with his tongue out, ears perked. They drove down the narrow country road that led to the main highway. The small town looked calm as ever. Kids riding bikes, people mowing lawns, someone walking out of the bakery with a bag of fresh bread. Jack parked outside the hardware store and went inside. He chatted briefly with the clerk, picked up what he needed, and headed back home. He never stayed in town long. He preferred being where it was quiet. By the time he got back, the sun was high and the day had grown warm. Jack spent the afternoon fixing the fence. Shadow stayed close, lying in the shade, but always alert. Every now and then, Jack would toss him a stick and Shadow would bring it back, tail wagging, eyes bright. Around late afternoon, Jack decided to take a break. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and sat on the porch with a bottle of water. Shadow rested at his feet, his chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. Everything was peaceful until it wasn't. Down the road, a police cruiser appeared. It wasn't unusual to see one pass by now and then, but this one slowed down near Jack's driveway. The car idled for a moment before turning in. Jack frowned slightly, setting his bottle down. Shadow lifted his head, ears up, eyes fixed on the approaching vehicle. A young officer stepped out. Jack didn't recognize him. He looked new, maybe fresh out of training. His uniform was crisp, his movements quick and slightly nervous. "Afternoon, sir," the officer said as he approached. Jack gave a small nod. "Afternoon. Everything all right out here?" the officer asked, glancing around the property. "Everything's fine," Jack said calmly. "Just working on the fence." The officer hesitated, looking down at his notepad. "We got a call from a neighbor. Said they saw someone out here moving around with tools and, well, they weren't sure who it was." Jack raised an eyebrow, surprised. "That'd be me," he said evenly. "This is my place." The officer nodded quickly, clearly embarrassed. "Oh, I see. Just making sure. Mind if I see some ID, sir?" Jack reached into his pocket and handed over his driver's license without a word. The officer studied it, then looked up again. "All right, Mr. Rayner, everything checks out." Jack took back the card and slipped it into his pocket. "Appreciate you doing your job," he said, his tone calm but cool. The officer gave a quick, uneasy smile. "Sorry for the trouble. We've just had a few reports of theft in the area lately, so we're being extra cautious." "No problem," Jack replied. "You have a good day, officer." The young man nodded and turned to head back to his car. Jack watched as he got in and drove off down the road. Shadow was still sitting by the porch steps, watching the car leave. Jack knelt beside him and scratched behind his ears. "People get jumpy easy these days," he said quietly. Shadow gave a soft huff in response, then relaxed again. Jack thought that would be the end of it. He didn't realize how quickly things could spiral from something so small. A few days later, he noticed another patrol car driving slowly past his property. Then another one the next evening. It wasn't alarming at first, but it was unusual. Jack didn't have visitors, didn't cause trouble, and always kept to himself. But something told him the department might still be watching. Maybe out of routine, maybe out of suspicion. That weekend, a storm rolled in. Rain fell steadily all night, and by morning the air was heavy and cool. Jack decided to do some indoor training with Shadow. It was something they did every few weeks to keep the dog sharp. He set up small obstacles in the yard once the rain stopped, a few barrels, an old fence post, and some targets for command drills. Shadow loved the routine. He responded to every word Jack said, moving with precision and focus. When Jack told him to sit, Shadow froze like a statue. When he gave the release word, Shadow sprinted across the yard with lightning speed. It wasn't aggressive training, just discipline, the same kind of work that had kept them both alive in the past. Jack smiled as he watched the dog move. "Still got it," he said quietly. Shadow barked once, almost like a laugh. What Jack didn't notice was a car parked down the road. A local deputy who happened to drive by and stop, thinking something suspicious was happening. From the distance, he saw a man shouting short, firm commands and a large dog running in fast, controlled motions. To someone unfamiliar, it might have looked intense, maybe even threatening. The deputy called it in, unsure of what he was seeing. "Possible aggressive dog situation," he said into the radio. Might be a dangerous animal or someone training attack dogs. Within minutes, another patrol car joined him. They decided to approach the property to check things out. Jack was standing near the fence line, giving Shadow his last command for the session. He didn't notice the two cars pulling into his driveway until the tires crunched on the gravel. Shadow turned first, ears up, eyes alert. Two officers stepped out, one of them the same young man from before. The other was older, more confident, and clearly in charge. Jack held up a hand in greeting. "Afternoon, officers. Something I can help you with?" The older officer spoke first.
"Sir, we received a call about possible dangerous animal behavior."
"Are you training attack dogs here?" Jack looked confused. "No, just running some obedience drills. He's my dog. He's well trained and not a threat to anyone." Shadow stood beside him, calm but watchful. His tail was still, his posture alert but not aggressive. The younger officer, clearly nervous, had his hand resting on his side. "Sir, can you put the dog on a leash, please?" Jack nodded slowly. "Of course. He's fine. But I'll do that." He turned slightly to reach for the leash hanging from a hook on the porch post. Shadow moved a step forward, still calm but focused on the strangers. The young officer stiffened, misunderstanding the motion. "It's okay," Jack said quickly, sensing the tension. "He's not going to—" But before he could finish, the older officer held out his hand. "Let's all stay calm here." Jack clipped the leash onto Shadow's collar and gave a firm command for him to sit. The dog obeyed instantly. "See?" Jack said softly. "He's under control." The officers exchanged a glance. The younger one seemed unsure whether to relax or stay on alert. Jack tried to keep his tone even. "You want to look around, that's fine. But there's no problem here." The older officer nodded. "We'll take a quick look, just routine." Jack stepped back, letting them check the area. Shadow stayed seated, eyes following their every move. After a few minutes, they realized everything was normal. Just a man, his dog, and some training equipment. The tension eased. The older officer gave a small nod. "All right, Mr. Rayner. Looks like everything's fine here. Sorry for the misunderstanding." Jack nodded in return. "No harm done." The young officer still looked uneasy, but he followed his partner back to the car. They got in, spoke briefly, and drove away. Jack stood quietly for a moment, then looked down at Shadow. "That could have gone bad," he murmured. Shadow gave a small whine, his head tilting as if he understood. Jack knelt down and rubbed the dog's neck. "Good boy. You stayed calm. You did everything right." But as the day went on, the encounter stuck with him. It wasn't anger, just a deep unease. In his world, mistakes born of fear could cost lives. And he could tell the young officer hadn't been ready for the situation. It wasn't the boy's fault, but it was a reminder of how quickly calm moments could turn into chaos when people didn't understand what they were seeing. That night, Jack sat on the porch again, the air cool after the rain. Shadow rested beside him, half asleep but still alert to every sound. Jack thought about how fragile peace really was, how one misunderstanding could ruin something built over years. He looked out into the dark field, the stars faint behind the drifting clouds. "We've been through worse," he said quietly. "But I don't like where this is heading." Shadow's tail thumped softly against the porch. Jack smiled faintly. "We'll be all right, boy. We always are." But deep down, something in his gut told him that peace was starting to slip away, and once it did, it wouldn't come back easily. The days after the visit from the officers felt heavier somehow. Nothing bad had happened, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The quiet peace he once felt on his land now carried a thin layer of tension, as if the air itself had grown restless. He still woke up before dawn, still took Shadow on their morning runs, still fixed things around the property, but his mind wasn't calm anymore. Every time a car slowed down near his fence line, his eyes would follow it. Every sound that broke the silence made him pause. He had lived through years where instincts kept him alive, and now those same instincts whispered that something was coming. Shadow seemed to feel it too. The dog stayed closer than usual, often watching the road instead of lying on the porch like he used to. When Jack worked outside, Shadow's eyes never left him. It wasn't fear, it was awareness, the kind that comes from sensing unease in someone you love. Jack tried to brush it off. Maybe he was overthinking things. Maybe it was just the memory of the last encounter replaying in his head. He wanted to believe that was all it was. That week, he went into town again. The streets were quiet, and the leaves had started to turn gold with the early signs of fall. He parked near the small grocery store and went inside to pick up a few things. The clerk, an older man who had known him since he moved there, greeted him with a friendly nod. "Haven't seen you in a bit, Jack. Everything good out your way?" Jack gave a small smile. "All good. Just keeping busy." "Good to hear," the clerk said. "You know, folks around here really like that you keep your place so clean. Some of the farms are falling apart, but you keep yours sharp as ever." Jack chuckled lightly. "Old habits," he said. He finished shopping and headed back to his truck. Shadow waited patiently in the passenger seat, eyes following Jack through the window. As they drove back, the radio played softly. A local news station talking about a recent string of burglaries in a nearby county. Jack barely listened. His thoughts drifted back to that uneasy feeling again. When he pulled into his driveway, he noticed something different. A small marker flag sat near the ditch by the road, the kind used by utility workers. He didn't remember anyone scheduling work out there. He got out, checked it, and saw fresh tire marks in the dirt nearby. "Looks like someone's been around," he muttered. Shadow sniffed the ground, tail low, nose twitching. Jack didn't like unknowns. They made him restless. That evening, after dinner, he took a small flashlight and walked the property line. The world was quiet, just the hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the wind. He checked the fence, the gate, and the trail that ran behind the trees. Everything seemed fine, but that unsettled feeling still lingered. When he returned to the porch, he stood for a moment staring at the dark line of trees. "We'll keep an eye out," he said softly. Shadow sat beside him, tail brushing against his boot. The next morning, Jack decided to visit the sheriff's office in town. He didn't want trouble, but he figured it wouldn't hurt to clear the air after the last misunderstanding. The sheriff, a broad man in his 50s with a calm voice, recognized him right away. "Jack Rayner," the sheriff said with a smile. "Haven't seen you in a while. What brings you in?" Jack sat across from him. "Just wanted to make sure everything's square between me and your deputies. Had a visit last week about some dog training." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Yeah, I heard about that." "Just routine checking. No harm meant." "I understand," Jack said. "I just don't want any more confusion. My dog's trained, but he's not dangerous. He listens to me. Always." The sheriff leaned back. "I know, Jack. You've been living out there without causing anyone trouble. We'll make sure my boys know to leave you be. Sometimes new deputies don't always have the right judgment yet." Jack nodded. "Appreciate that." They talked a few more minutes about the neighborhood and the recent thefts that had put the deputies on edge. When Jack left, he felt a little better. Maybe things would go back to normal now. For a few days they did. The air felt lighter again. The runs with Shadow became peaceful once more. Jack started to relax. He even thought about fixing up the old shed out back, something he'd been putting off for months. But then, one quiet evening, the calm cracked again. It was just past sunset when Jack heard a car pull up near the end of his driveway. It wasn't unusual for people to turn around there, but this one didn't move. The headlights stayed on, cutting across the field. Shadow's ears went up immediately. Jack stood and walked toward the porch rail, watching. After a moment, he saw two figures step out of the car, both wearing jackets with the local sheriff's emblem. He sighed quietly. "Not again," he murmured. He walked down the steps slowly, keeping his voice calm. "Evening, officers," he called out. "Something I can help you with?" One of them, a woman this time, raised a hand. "Evening, sir. We're following up on a report from earlier today. Someone said they heard yelling and thought it might be a dispute." Jack frowned. "Yelling? There's no one out here but me and my dog. Mind if we take a quick look around?" she asked politely. Jack hesitated. He knew he had nothing to hide, but it bothered him that they kept showing up over nothing. Still, he nodded. "Go ahead. Just stay calm. My dog's here and he's protective." He turned and called softly, "Stay." Shadow froze where he was, watching every move the officers made. The younger one looked nervous again. Jack recognized him. It was the same deputy from before. He kept glancing at Shadow, one hand resting too close to his belt. Jack kept his tone steady. "He's fine. Just don't make any sudden moves. He's trained to follow my voice." The officers walked around for a minute, shining flashlights near the fence and the trees. The woman turned back. "Everything seems fine. Sorry to bother you again." "No harm done," Jack said, though his patience was wearing thin. As they walked back to their car, the young deputy looked at Shadow one more time. "That's one serious-looking dog. he muttered under his breath. Jack caught the comment and said quietly, "He's serious about protecting what's his." The woman gave a polite nod. Then they got in the car and left. Jack stood in the driveway long after the sound of the engine faded. Shadow sat beside him, calm but alert. "Something's off," Jack said softly. "We didn't do anything wrong, but it feels like we're being watched." He didn't like being the center of attention. He had spent his whole life staying under the radar, moving quietly, doing what needed to be done without recognition. Now, for the first time in years, it felt like eyes were on him again, and not friendly ones. Over the next week, Jack decided to take a different approach. If people were going to keep making assumptions, he'd give them no reason to misunderstand anything. He started doing his training sessions earlier in the morning when the town was still asleep. He kept Shadow on the leash more often, even on their runs. Still, that feeling of being watched didn't go away. He noticed small things: a vehicle parked just long enough to be suspicious, a neighbor's curious glance that lingered too long. None of it was proof, but all of it made his instincts flare. Then one afternoon, Jack got a call from the sheriff himself. "Jack, I wanted to reach out," the sheriff said. "Heard from one of my deputies that you've been getting some extra attention lately. Just wanted you to know it's not personal. We're trying to keep an eye out for some things in the area." Jack appreciated the call but couldn't help asking, "Do I look like trouble to you, Sheriff?" The sheriff chuckled. "Not to me, but some of the younger ones don't understand that not every quiet man is hiding something." Jack smiled faintly. "Well, I'll keep to myself like I always have." "That's all we ask," the sheriff replied. When the call ended, Jack set the phone down and looked at Shadow, who was lying by the door watching him. "People see what they want to see," he said quietly. "But that's not our problem." That night, Jack wrote in his old notebook, a habit he had picked up during his service years. He didn't write much, just small notes to clear his thoughts. Sometimes peace is not about where you are. It's about what you choose not to fight. He closed the notebook, exhaled deeply, and turned off the light. Shadow followed him to bed, curling up near the foot like always. As the days went on, the pattern of quiet and disturbance continued. Some days were peaceful. Others brought unwanted visits or glances from passing cars. But through it all, Jack stayed calm. He had learned long ago that reacting out of emotion never solved anything. Instead, he started documenting things: license plates, dates, small notes about the times cars passed by or when someone came to his gate. He didn't plan to use it for anything, but it made him feel in control again. He also began to think about his past differently. Maybe part of the reason people misunderstood him was because he carried himself like a man trained for war. Even when he was relaxed, there was something about him that drew attention. That awareness, that stillness, it wasn't something he could turn off. One evening, as the sun went down, Jack sat by the porch again, his eyes on the horizon. The world looked peaceful in that golden light. Shadow rested beside him, his head on his paws. Jack spoke softly, almost to himself. "You and me, boy. We've seen worse. But I have a feeling life's testing us again." Shadow lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Jack's. It was a silent exchange, one of those wordless moments that spoke louder than anything. Jack smiled faintly and reached down to pat his head. "We'll handle it like we always do. One step at a time. For now, that was enough." The world might have been closing in with suspicion and misunderstanding, but Jack had learned long ago that storms pass if you keep your footing. What he didn't know was that the next storm wouldn't be the kind that came with rain or thunder. It would come quietly, unexpectedly, from the very people who were supposed to protect others. But on that calm evening, Jack believed things would settle. He believed the world still had a bit of peace left for him and his loyal friend. And so, as the last light faded from the sky, he leaned back in his chair, listening to the wind move through the trees, hoping that tomorrow would bring another quiet day. The weeks passed slowly, but the uneasy feeling around Jack's home never really faded. The patrol cars came by less often now, yet Jack could sense that something still lingered in the air, an unspoken suspicion that hadn't gone away. He didn't blame anyone, not really. People were just doing their jobs. But deep down, he couldn't help feeling that the peace he had worked so hard to build was slipping through his fingers. He didn't know why, but he could tell the calm he had loved for years was about to change again. One morning, he woke up before sunrise as usual. The sky was pale blue and the grass sparkled with dew. Jack poured himself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch. Shadow was already awake, standing alert, tail swaying slightly. "Morning, partner," Jack said softly. Shadow gave a quiet bark, almost like a greeting. They started their morning run, their feet and paws leaving soft marks in the dirt trail. The forest was peaceful, the smell of pine, the sound of birds waking up. For a moment, Jack let himself forget everything. It was just him, the air, and the dog who had been by his side through everything. When they returned, Jack noticed a pickup truck parked near the road, half hidden behind the trees. He didn't recognize it. He watched it for a long moment, but it didn't move. Eventually, he went inside, trying to ignore the uneasy tug in his chest. Later that day, he drove into town to run errands. He stopped by the diner for lunch. The waitress, an older woman who had always treated him kindly, filled his cup with coffee and smiled. "You're quiet today," she said. Jack nodded. "Just thinking. About what?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "How things change even when you try your best to keep them the same." She gave a sympathetic smile. "That's life, isn't it? Never stay still for long." Jack smiled faintly. "Guess not." After lunch, he headed to the sheriff's office to drop off a few documents related to his land. The sheriff wasn't there, but one of the deputies took the papers and thanked him. Jack could tell from the young man's eyes that the last few months of confusion and reports had spread through the small department. He could almost feel people's curiosity whenever he walked into a room now. It didn't bother him personally, but it made him more careful. The quiet life he had wanted was no longer invisible. When he got home, the truck he had seen earlier was gone. Still, Shadow sniffed around the fence line, his posture stiff. Jack trusted the dog's instincts more than his own sometimes. "What do you smell, boy?" he asked softly. Shadow gave a low whine and stayed close to the gate. Jack looked out at the road again, then turned and walked back to the porch. "We'll stay alert," he said, mostly to himself. That night, as he sat outside with a cup of tea, he thought about his old life again. There had been times in the service when something didn't feel right, even before anyone said a word. He had learned to listen to those instincts. They had saved him more than once. And now, sitting there under the stars, he felt that same quiet tension creeping in again. A few days later, Jack heard a knock on his door just after sunset. He opened it to find the sheriff standing there. "Evening, Jack," the sheriff said with a small nod. "Evening," Jack replied. "Everything all right?" "Just wanted to stop by." "Got a few minutes?" Jack stepped aside to let him in. They sat at the small table in the kitchen. The sheriff removed his hat and placed it down gently. "I wanted to talk about something," he began. "We had another call come in a couple of days ago. Someone saying they heard gunshots out this way. My deputies came by, didn't see anything, but I thought I'd check in myself." Jack frowned. "Gunshots? I don't even own a firearm anymore. Haven't for years." The sheriff nodded. "That's what I figured. Probably just hunters out in the woods. But with all the recent reports, I wanted to make sure you're not being bothered by anyone." Jack leaned back slightly. "No one's been on my property except a few curious cars. But I've noticed a truck parked near the road lately." The sheriff sighed. "Could be locals. Could be nothing. I'll look into it." "Appreciate it," Jack said quietly. Before leaving, the sheriff gave him a long look. "You've kept to yourself for years, Jack, never caused trouble. But the way people talk in town, you might want to be careful. Folks start building stories in their heads when they don't understand someone." Jack smiled faintly. "I stopped worrying about what people think a long time ago." "I know," the sheriff said. "But sometimes what they think has a way of catching up to you anyway." After the sheriff left, Jack sat in silence for a long time. Shadow lay near the door, watching him with calm eyes. Jack reached down and rubbed his neck. "They still don't get it, do they? They don't know who we are or what we've been through. They just see what's on the surface." Shadow pressed his head against Jack's leg as if to say it didn't matter. A few days later, something unexpected happened. A reporter from a small local newspaper showed up at his gate. Jack spotted her car from the window and stepped outside before she could approach too far. "Mr. Rayner?" she called out. "That's me," Jack said, his voice polite but cautious. "I'm writing a piece on veterans in the area. I heard about your background and thought maybe you'd be willing to talk." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. "My background?" "Yes, sir," she said quickly. "Someone mentioned you served in special operations. I just thought it would be good for people to know your story." Jack was quiet for a long moment. "Where did you hear that?" She hesitated. "Word gets around." He gave a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. Ma'am, I appreciate what you're doing, but I'm not the kind of man who talks about the past. It's better left there. She nodded, clearly disappointed. I understand. If you ever change your mind, I won't, Jack said gently but firmly. But thank you. She gave a polite smile and left. Jack watched her car disappear down the road. He didn't feel angry, just tired. The last thing he wanted was attention. Yet somehow, without saying a word, his quiet life was becoming a story for other people to tell. That night he sat on the porch again, staring at the stars. He could almost hear the sounds of the past, the steady hum of engines, the low voices of his old team, the soft growl of Shadow's younger bark when danger was near. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, he noticed Shadow sitting upright, looking toward the road. A pair of headlights moved slowly past the property. Jack watched in silence until they disappeared. Still watching, he muttered, "Let them. We've got nothing to hide." But what Jack didn't know was that things were already changing in town. The story about him had spread, about the quiet man living alone with his trained dog, about the military guy who kept to himself, about how deputies had visited his place more than once. And like all small-town rumors, each time it was told it grew a little bigger, a little stranger. People started wondering who he really was. Some said he'd been in secret missions overseas. Others whispered that he'd been involved in something too classified to mention. The truth didn't matter much anymore. Stories had a way of shaping their own reality. The sheriff tried to put an end to the gossip, but rumors move faster than facts. And soon enough, someone higher up in the county started asking questions about Jack. Background checks were done, old records quietly reviewed. That's when the truth surfaced, the full record of who Jack Rayner really was. A retired commander. Delta Force. Commendations few people had ever seen. The information reached a few desks before someone in the local government realized what they were looking at. Word spread quickly, this time in quiet circles rather than loud ones. The man people thought was just a loner fixing fences was someone who had once led operations that shaped the course of national security. The next day, the sheriff drove out to see Jack again, not as an officer, but as a man who now understood the weight of who stood before him. When Jack opened the door, the sheriff gave a quiet smile. "Jack, I owe you an apology." Jack looked puzzled. "For what?" "For not understanding who you are. For letting all this nonsense go too far." Jack tilted his head slightly. "You did your job, Sheriff. That's all." "Maybe," the sheriff said, "but you didn't deserve the suspicion. Not after everything you've done." Jack didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what to say. He had spent years trying to escape that part of his life, and now it had found him again. "Let's just say," the sheriff continued, "some of us learned who you really are, and we're grateful." Jack looked out toward the field where Shadow was running along the fence line. "I'm just a man trying to live quietly. That's all I ever wanted." "I get that," the sheriff said softly, "but I think people should know the truth. It might change how they see you." Jack shook his head. "I don't need people to see me any differently. I just want them to leave us in peace." The sheriff nodded. "I'll make sure they do." After he left, Jack sat down on the porch steps watching the sun dip below the trees. Shadow came up beside him, panting lightly. "Well, partner," Jack said quietly, "looks like the past doesn't stay buried forever." Shadow rested his head on Jack's knee. Jack smiled faintly and whispered, "That's all right. We'll handle it like we always do." He didn't realize it yet, but the story of the quiet man and his loyal dog was already spreading far beyond the town. Because sometimes, the truth finds a way to rise on its own. And this time it would reveal not just who Jack was, but how deeply one man's loyalty, courage, and quiet strength could still inspire the world.